region that we were just looking at, another name for it collectively, derived from the same embryonic tissue as the corpus spongiosum. And probably that's where the term bulb came in. During sexual arousal, it becomes engorged with blood. So both male and female structures become engorged with blood. And of course, parasympathetic innervation from the pudendal nerve, which branches out into a whole bunch of other nerves, but they're all sacral. Every one of them is sacral. And remember, craniosacral outflow is parasympathetic. A person needs to be in the parasympathetic mode if they wish to engage in reproductive activity. Okay? The hymen is undoubtedly a protective structure that persists to varying ages, although these days females are so active, it's quite variable in how long it hangs around. Okay, so let's look at the cell division that goes on. Here we're just looking at the oocyte. Okay, here we're looking at the entire follicle. But we see before birth, we have the oogonium, which is the stem cell, and the oogonium reproduces by mitosis, analogous to the spermatogonium. Remember those? And the spermatogonium are reproducing like crazy because we make so many sperm. Not nearly so many oocytes are made, but the oogonia reproduce, they're diploid, and they reproduce by mitosis. Okay, and during childhood, the whole thing kind of stops for a while, and then each month from puberty to menopause, a few of them extend FSH receptors, and these are arrested in what I believe to be metaphase 1, not prophase 1, and arrested in metaphase 1 to get the primordial follicle, and in the vesicular follicle, remember about the last thing to happen was, here it says arrested in metaphase 2, see? And so the last thing to happen in the vesicular follicle is the completion of meiosis 1, and we produce this polar body, which is just a little package of chromosomes. And you see the chromosomes are lined up down the middle there, clearly shown there. And so it's arrested, and you can see what is called the meiotic spindle. There's a bunch of little filaments that are attached to each chromosome, and those little filaments get shorter during anaphase, and that's what pulls the chromosomes apart. Okay? And eventually, you're going to wind up, only if sperm penetration occurs, meiosis 2 is completed, and you wind up with the fertilized egg and 3 polar bodies. Okay?
Why does it say all polar bodies degenerate?
Because they do. They just kind of go away. There's no room for them. If all those polar bodies became oocytes, the ovary would wind up being 4 times as big. There would be no room for all that. See, on the male, because the oocyte is the largest cell in the body, and you start proliferating those, and they're going to take up a lot of room. A male can make 300 million sperm a day. That's unthinkably small. And if the sperm are, and one thing I never mentioned is if the sperm aren't used or ejaculated, they're reabsorbed, it's thought, by the tail of the epididymis. So, okay, and so just a reminder that in mitosis 1, the chromosomes line up single file, and there's only one way you can line up single file. And in meiosis 1, they line up side by side, and there are different ways you can line up side by side, because you got one from your mom and one from your dad. Meiosis results not in an infinite number of offspring variations, only 4.5 million, 2 to the 22nd. Okay? So if we had 26 or 27 chromosome pairs, it would be a much larger number, wouldn't it? Okay. So, but there's 4.5 million ways that 23 pairs of chromosomes could line up, so, before they're pulled apart. So, same kind of picture. Then meiosis 2 is just the halves of the bow ties are pulled apart. And in mitosis, you wind up with identical diploid daughter cells. And in meiosis, you wind up with non-identical haploid gametes. So the estrogens, what do you think about, what do estrogens do? What are they responsible for?
Growth and development.
Growth and development, yep. So they're responsible for the secondary sex characteristic, all the things that make females look different than males. Breast development, growth and maintenance of the female reproductive tract, the female pattern of fat deposition, the female pattern of calcium metabolism, growth and development of all those things. And maintenance, okay? So growth and development and maintenance of the female reproductive tract. It's hard to know the role that testosterone plays in bone metabolism, because there is no period in life when men all of a sudden get the supply cut off. So testosterone may play some role in bone metabolism, but we know estrogen does. And in the absence of estrogen, some females experience, as you know, osteoporosis, so, which is a problem basically with the osteoblast ratio. The growth and development of breasts, the female pattern of fat deposition, central nervous system, and some subtle aspects of behavior, quite a few metabolic effects, well, not all of which are perfectly well understood. So that at the time of menopause, there's quite a few changes that are tolerated to differing degrees by different individuals. Okay, growth and development of breasts. Okay, the female pattern of fat deposition. Bone metabolism. Maintenance of the female reproductive tract. So that's estrogen. Progesterone, any of those structures which were glandular, that we just discussed, require progesterone to be able to secrete their substrates, whatever it is they secrete. So function of the mammary glands and of the endometrial glands is particularly relevant in pregnancy and to function of the endometrial glands. Causes mammary glands to secrete milk. Also required is a pituitary hormone called prolactin. Causes endometrial glands to secrete nutrients and other substances. Provides hormonal support for the endometrium. Without progesterone, the endometrium sloughs off. And if something happens to the estrogen supply during pregnancy, the fetus will be aborted. So, control of ovarian function. Okay? And as we know, it's another one of these trophic situations. Okay? And trophic control, which is, of course, is overseen by the hypothalamus. Okay? So the hypothalamus at puberty secretes the releasing factor, GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which in turn causes the adenohypophysis to secrete the two trophic hormones. What are the two trophic hormones?
Estrogen.
FSH and LH are the two trophic hormones. So, which of the following secretes GnRH? Hypothalamus, adenohypophysis, ovary. Hypothalamus. Which of the following secretes FSH? Hypophysis or adenohypophysis. Which of the following secretes estrogen? Would you pick ovary? Okay, more specifically, it's those specific cells that we pointed out. Okay, so one of my favorite questions is, you know, is a specific hormone made? And another one is, what is the stimulus for its release? And another one is, once it's released, what does it do? Okay. So, the gonadotrophic hormones are secreted by the adenohypophysis. So here we're looking at the menstrual cycle, and we're going to be looking at that starting from day 1 to day 28. And like any cycle, we could start anywhere, but by convention, we start with the first day of menstruation. Okay? And so it's not exactly 28 days long. That's an average for most people. And we see that at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, FSH levels have already risen. And the reason they have risen is because estrogen and progesterone levels dropped at the end of the previous menstrual cycle, and negative feedback finally told the pituitary to start secreting FSH. And so those follicles which were expressing FSH receptors start to mature. This is called, there are several ways of naming the menstrual cycle. This is called the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle because follicles begin to mature in this phase. FSH is being secreted and follicles are selected. Okay? Then at the middle of the cycle is marked by the so-called LH surge. The LH surge is the cause of ovulation. Okay? And ovulation is regarded as the middle of the menstrual cycle. After ovulation, there are several ways we can name the post-ovulatory portion. You could call it the luteal phase, because that's when you have the corpus luteum. Okay? And if you're going to name it with regard to what goes on in the ovary, you could call it the follicular phase and the luteal phase, okay, of the menstrual cycle. And during the luteal phase, we're secreting progesterone, and so there's going to be glandular structures, particularly in the endometrium, are going to start to secrete their nutrients. Okay? And so here we see the endometrium. So if you name it the different phases of the menstrual cycle with regard to the endometrium, you can name the first part, the pre-ovulatory part, the proliferative phase, because this is under the influence of estrogen. The endometrium is growing and developing, and the endometrial glands are growing and developing. And under the second phase, we would call it the secretory phase, because that's when the endometrial glands are secreting their nutrients. And it is during this period when implantation is going to occur, because fertilization is going to happen right around here, isn't it? Okay? Right around the time of ovulation. And if it takes about 5.5 days for the embryo to reach the uterus, then the endometrium is going to be at the time of maximum development. And so implantation, so these endometrial glands are secreting their nutrients at the maximum time. You see that estrogen, shown in purple, levels are at their highest right at the time that implantation would occur. And so The high levels of progesterone would stimulate these endometrial glands to secrete their nutrients maximally to harbor and nurture the implanted embryo. And we're going to be talking all about that next week. So you see, estrogen is produced during the entire menstrual cycle. But since progesterone is only produced by the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum only exists during the second half, you only get progesterone production during the second half. Estrogen production drops off after ovulation because the poor follicle, ruptured follicle, is kind of in a state of shock for a while, but then it starts to bounce back and secrete both progesterone and estrogen. Okay. There are 3 feedback relationships between the ovary and pituitary that will help you understand the menstrual cycle. Okay? If you understand these 3 feedback relationships, you can rationalize every bit of the menstrual cycle. And when I show you a picture of the entire menstrual cycle, you will see why you need some mnemonic device to try and figure it out. Everything is kind of flatlined with the male. When you look at a graph of what goes on in the female, it kind of looks like the Himalayan mountains. So certainly isn't flatlined. Slowly rising estrogen levels cause the pituitary to reduce FSH secretion. This is what you have after about halfway through the first half of the menstrual cycle. You have slowly rising estrogen levels because the follicle is just starting to secrete some estrogen. Okay. Rapidly rising estrogen levels tell the pituitary to initiate the LH surge. So you see, these are things that the ovary is telling the pituitary, making the pituitary do. Okay? So slowly rising estrogen levels tell the pituitary to reduce FSH secretion. Rapidly rising estrogen levels tell the pituitary to initiate the LH surge. Finally, during the second half of the menstrual cycle, you have high levels of both estrogen and progesterone, and that causes the pituitary to cease production of both FSH and LH. So you have very little production of FSH and LH during the second half of the menstrual cycle. Okay. And so this just says a little bit about luteinizing hormone. The word luteinizing kind of makes you think of the corpus luteum, doesn't it? And luteinizing hormone does 2 things. It's responsible for, I always get a kick out of when they just show the egg falling out there. But the luteinizing hormone induces ovulation, and it also is responsible for the conversion. It facilitates the conversion of the ruptured follicle to the corpus luteum. Okay, luteinizing hormone. So it helps form, without luteinizing hormone, there would be no corpus luteum. So, LH induces ovulation, and it facilitates the conversion of the ruptured follicle to the corpus luteum. Okay? So here's a picture in your book, which is a little bit hard to follow, but let's see if we can follow it using our those 3 feedback relationships. So we, at the very beginning of the menstrual cycle, FSH levels are high, and so that selects some follicles, and those selected follicles slowly start to produce some estrogen. Slowly rising estrogen levels exert negative feedback on the pituitary and tell it to quit making so much FSH. Just like we said, that's the first feedback relationship. As the follicle continues to grow, it starts to secrete more and more estrogen. The estrogen kind of has a self-stimulating effect on the follicle. the follicle secretes more estrogen, which causes the follicle to develop more, which causes it to secrete more estrogen, which causes it to develop more, which causes it to secrete more estrogen. And pretty soon you have high estrogen levels, which tell the pituitary to do the LH surge. The LH surge causes ovulation, okay? And high levels of both estrogen and progesterone tell the pituitary to back off on both FSH and LH secretion for the second half of the menstrual cycle. And estrogen or progesterone levels are high during the second half of the menstrual cycle. Some people say that that might be responsible for the nominal amount of breast pain that some females feel during the latter part of the menstrual cycle, but there's no proof of that. This is a pretty good picture in your book. It shows the sort of the follicular phase, the first half of the menstrual cycle, and the development of the granulosa cells and the thecal cells. And you're just starting to see a little bit of fluid in there. And if you use your imagination, you might even see, it seems to me that would label a zona pellucida. But anyway, this is probably a late secondary follicle. And the thecal cells, interestingly, actually make male sex hormones, and the granulosa cells convert those to estrogen. And if you look at the molecular structures of testosterone and estrogen, they're not that far apart. So the granulosa cells are responsible for estrogen production. And so finally we get to a mature vesicular follicle, which is ovulated. It's the LH surge that causes that. And it's hard to show this with one picture, really. And finally, high levels of both estrogen and progesterone during the second half tell the pituitary to shut off FSH and LH. Okay, the uterus, and there we see it, very thick muscular structure. Okay. I've heard gynecologists call it the baby carriage, and it certainly is. The inner lining, the endometrium, is a pivotal structure in reproductive physiology. Implantation really occurs a little bit further up than that, typically about there. Okay. Highly muscular structure. Okay. This is, in younger females, the uterus is virtually always in a normal younger female who's never been pregnant. The female is always anteverted over the roof of the urinary bladder like this. And if you look at a coronal MRI, it slices right through there. You can just see the uterus peeking over the top of the urinary bladder. Okay, but after pregnancy, who knows what position the uterus will be left in, because especially if a birth was involved. So, have you guys ever heard the term prima gravida, primipara, nulla gravida, nullipara? They're good nursing terms that are still used. They're used to describe the history of a female. If a female is nulla gravida, it means she has never been pregnant. If she's nullipara, it means she's never given birth. But it doesn't say anything about whether or not she's been pregnant. Okay? Typically, these are the kinds of words that gynecologists will write in their reports. If a woman is primipara, it means she's given birth once. If she's prima gravida, it means that she's been pregnant once, but probably hasn't given birth, otherwise they'd say primipara. You know. So they're pretty good words that you will hear in the nursing profession if you don't become neurologists instead. So, beard if you become a neurologist. Retroflexion or anteflexion are not nice, at least not if you're interested in conceiving and bearing children, because if the uterus is bent to this extent, it's not a version, it's not a retroversion, it's a retroflexion. And that kink in the lumen, the sperm aren't generally able to get through that usually. It also causes severe problems with pelvic anatomy because the rectum usually is shifted over from one side, and that may cause problems with the stool and whatever. So, but needless to say, the uterus can be in all kinds of different positions. Okay. This is a top view. For some reason, I keep showing this. I sort of have mixed feelings about it. But there we see the uterus and the tubes on either side. And just posterior, we see the rectum, sigmoid colon. Okay, posterior view. Fertilization usually occurs right about here. It's called the ampulla of the oviduct. But of course you hear about it happening all kinds of places. Okay, so the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, very pivotal in reproductive physiology and embryology. Okay, the embryo implants in the endometrium. And if we look at the arteries which nourish the endometrium, they are numerous, but there's also some sort of interesting features. The proximal part of the arteries are coiled or spiral, and under the influence of estrogen and progesterone, these arteries remain patent, highly functional, but in the absence of estrogen and progesterone, those spiral arteries constrict, cutting off the blood flow, and that's what causes the degeneration of the endometrium that leads to menstruation. So there are two different ways that you can talk about the endometrium. You can talk about it in terms of function, which is the way I prefer to talk about it. There's a superficial layer which sloughs off during menstruation once a month. And there's the basal layer, which is still part of the same tissue, but it doesn't slough off. You gotta have a basal layer because it grows a new superficial layer every month. Okay? So the basal layer and the superficial layer. And so here we see the highly developed tissue of the endometrium. These are endometrial glands. And this is probably at the time of maximum growth, probably about day 25 or 26 of the menstrual cycle during the secretory phase, or the luteal phase, whichever you want to call it. This is the part that's going to slough off unless there's a pregnancy, and it's called the functional layer. This is the basal layer, which doesn't slough off, but it's basically made out of the same tissue. Okay, you can talk about it in terms of function, like we just did, the superficial layer and the basal layer, or you can talk about the fact you got a single layer. What's causing me to burp? I don't know what, because I didn't eat that much. But we have a single layer of simple columnar epithelium, and then all of this down here to the myometrium. This is all what is called stroma, and it's basically analogous to loose areolar tissue, loose areolar connective tissue, only there's more cells. There's not quite as much ground substance, and there's more cells than your typical loose areolar connective tissue. And it's highly glandular with these endometrial glands. So histologically, you can talk about the epithelium and the stroma, but I'd sort of sooner talk about the functional and the basal layer. The functional layer is what sloughs off every month, and the basal layer is what remains and gives rise to a new superficial layer every month. So you gotta develop new arteries and veins and endometrial glands every month. But probably the rationale for that is to have highly viable, fresh tissue every month for the implanted embryo. Okay, coiled versus straight arteries, that other picture was better. Here we go. And so, in the absence of estrogen and progesterone, these constrict, causing the superficial layer to slough off. And this presumably is the basal layer right here, which remains behind. So let's talk about the menstrual cycle, armed with all of this. And you may feel like we just did, but we really haven't formally quite done it yet. So by convention, the first day of the menstrual cycle is said to be the first day of menstruation. That's when a person can start keeping track. And so menstrual flow is caused by the corpus luteum finally shutting off at the end of the previous menstrual cycle. The corpus luteum shuts off, and the absence of estrogen and progesterone causes those spiral arteries to constrict, and this is the superficial layer right there, and it sloughs off, okay? And finally it gets completely sloughed off, and FSH levels, so this is happening in the uterus. At the same time, FSH is causing some new primordial follicles to grow in the ovary, and the granulosa cells right around in here are starting to slowly secrete some estrogen. And the new supply of estrogen, remember, growth and development. So if we're talking about the endometrium, we would call this the proliferative phase, because the endometrium is proliferating. Growth and development under the influence of estrogen. The second part would be called the secretory phase, because the newly formed endometrial glands are starting to secrete